The presentation overview of the theoretical methodological research is really what I do. It's very technical, but it is driven by real world problems. In the last conference I was at, they were honoring Bill Cooper, who started the business school at Carnegie Mellon, and his whole thought was that all theory should be driven by actual real world problems. And that was kind of a theme when I started doing the work that I do, to let the actual example problem I was looking at guide what I was doing. And the theme that we'll see here, and it's only to a limited extent, I wasn't able to throw everything in there, but the integration across disciplines, which has been a focus of my research, and it was when I was a graduate student as well. Non-technical discussion of methodology. I was told to keep it non-technical, so I left all the equations out, but as an economist, I had to put a couple, 2 or 3 graphs in there, so you'll see some of those. Research contributions and highlighting some of the applications. I'll do that and then talk about some of the future work in terms of what I'm doing now based on what I've done in the past. That if you want more outcomes in the education process, school districts would have to spend more money. So if you want to improve, then you need to spend more. And so that was the focus of where the starting point was for the research that I do. Now, in terms of inefficiency, the actual method and the focus on inefficiency occurs across multiple disciplines. So you see it in industrial engineering, microeconomics, of course, and operations research and other areas. But these are the mathematics. They actually are contributing to the methodology in terms of measuring the efficiency. And Brent was mentioning about people in the business school working with people in industrial engineering. I've had the fortune of not at UD, but some of my colleagues are in fact engineers, industrial engineers in Canada and Texas A&M, and so I have had the fortune to work with some of those guys. And so the idea here is that there could be a school district that's spending above the minimum cost. They're wasting their resources, and this is if we could come up with a way to measure what the best practice spending is, we can, and the numbers here are just drawn so I could get the easy graph in Excel. Otherwise, I couldn't get the curves to line up, so I did it that way. So if we can actually measure it relative to the frontier, we can come up with an idea of inefficiency and find ways for the school district or firm, whatever, to improve. And that's been the focus of a lot of research in industrial engineering and operations research. And I believe microeconomics gives you that foundation with that, if we can understand that relationship between outcome and spending in this case. Okay, so my starting point was microeconomic production theory, which turned out to be there's arguments within the community. So I got to be careful when I talk at the conferences, because I get some people from industrial engineering that argue that economics should be taken out of it, which for the economists we don't understand it, because that's the whole basis for what we do. So I'll write it down here as the foundation. Measurement, the technique I use is linear programming, and of course the contributions primarily in operations research, mathematics, industrial engineering, and there's been a little bit in economics in terms of the actual method in terms of linear programming. But the area where there's a lot of interdisciplinary work, it's the applications. And so I've just listed some. I know I've left some off, but economics and finance, management, MIS, mathematics, POM, industrial engineering, public administration, marketing, accounting, operations research, all these areas do applications. So they're trying to apply the methodology that I work in, the theory, those applications, and apply it to various things. And so I've actually, not all of these, but a lot of these application areas I've actually been able to do, primarily with co-authors who are interested in those particular areas. So there is a cross-disciplinary work in terms of applications. So as the methods guy, we could apply it to some of these other business disciplines in particular. Strong evidence. They didn't start out focusing on this, but the strong evidence of the environmental factors on educational outcomes and things that we now know. Coleman really highlighted the importance of these factors. Poorer school districts don't do as well, and so it depends on the socioeconomic status of students. If students come from an environment where there's poverty, they tend not to do well. And so Hanyashek, an economist at Rochester, he motivated this whole discussion with how do we model educational production. And the focus was from the Coleman report and the idea that a lot of what goes on in schools is beyond the control of the actual schools themselves, and it depends on what the parents are doing, what the community's like, et cetera. So that was the foundation for the starting point for what I did. And so don't compare, it's not fair to compare the inner city to Oakwood, those sort of comparisons. And so that was properly controlled for, and that was the first model. So this paper here built on a lot of different disciplines in terms of constructing it, and it was all found by an error in some of the existing models. Okay, so here it is. I mean, from the previous diagram, I just throw another cost curve, and there's just two cost curves here. The blue one up on top just represents that you could have a harsh environment. So you could be someone from a poorer district, and you'd have to spend more to achieve the same outcome as someone who's got the favorable district. And so this was, I mean, as obvious as it seems, it's just ignored in the education literature and all the applications that I saw on the production economics side. So we have to properly control for that. Otherwise, you're going to be making false statements that red dot, whatever that school district is actually inefficient when it's not. It's just because it's got the harsher environment, perhaps due to bad socioeconomic variables for the district. And so that's the foundation. And you can also start to see some of the other implications that I'm going to highlight later. In terms of this, it's that spending differences, which was a large focus of the education literature on equity, spending differences somehow mean that there's unfairness in the process. And what we can see right here is not. I mean, there could be higher spending just because it's more costly to produce a given outcome because of the harsher environment. And also, if we get rid of that line and talk about inefficiency, you can see differences in spending. Wealthier districts might be wasting money. And so is that inequity that they're wasting money? And that was some of the implications of the empirical stuff that I worked on. I extended it to do some other things to the cost side because I had problems with the data on the production side because there weren't a lot of good resources. Like we know teacher data, that's a good resource to use. But some of the other ones we don't have. We don't have the number of computers or the quality of the computers and all that information. So I had to find a way to go to the cost side, which is what I did. And in fact, typically what I do now in terms of my empirical work, going to the cost side instead, which in fact is the graphs that I showed. Other ones, returns to scale. Other ways that we can get fined for school districts. This became important in the 90s when they wanted to find ways to improve the performance of schools in Ohio when they didn't have extra funding. And so by focusing on returns to scale, the standard returns to scale in economics, we can find ways just by diverting resources within a school district and see improved performance and without spending any more money. So that was the applications. And here I put this one up here only because it's a link to the other disciplines where I benefited from. Bill Duncombe, my co-author, is a public administration. He's not an economist. And one of the things that we wanted to look at were some of the theories of inefficiency. What causes inefficiency? And some of the specific hypotheses that I've listed here. Competition. Presumably, if there's more competition, you're going to see less inefficiency. We didn't find that in some of our work. Tenure causes more inefficiency. And I believe that, in fact, because of the findings I had, we should get rid of the tenure system for everyone but me. That would be the way to do it. And I think if we did that, I mean, we could just take a little inefficiency on my end and improve it for everybody else. I think that would be good. This paper here, this was published in the Public Administration Journal, which now claims to be #1. I don't think it is, but they claim it. And it's in the top 3. Weak evidence linking. The model was really at an early stage, and the methods that were used was really weak. The data were bad, and we didn't find much evidence, except for maybe a little tenure issue with tenure. And so when we extended it to the cost side and we published it in Public Choice, we found much more evidence of the inefficiency, the causes of inefficiency. School district size, tenure teachers, wealth of the district is positively related, and percent of adults who are college educated. So the more educated, the more efficient they are. So some of the factors that you would expect. We took these from Chubb and Moe's book from political science and some of the theories of inefficiency. Interestingly enough, the move now, this was done and obviously ignored because a lot of the focus of the literature now, they're arguing is this is what we should be doing, trying to find those causes of inefficiency and stop focusing on the measurement issues, which is what we did back here. But I'll probably have to return to that because that's where the literature is going to be moving. In that case, the one I liked, but unfortunately, I think of all my articles, the one with no cites. The issue of equity. What I did was I took the basic modeling that within efficiency and just did the Gini coefficient, some of the measures of inequity that we see, and And then we fixed it for inefficiency. So we removed the inefficiency. And what we find is if you control for inefficiency in the cost environment, it turns out that half of the perceived inequity that existed in the New York schools, I believe it was, New York schools, just disappears. And so a lot of what people talk about inequity, how one district spends more than another, was actually just inefficiency and environmental cost. And so we can get a handle on the environmental cost and properly fund that. But a lot of the inefficiency is when people were talking about how unfair things are. It's actually just inefficiency. And if we could find ways to improve the schools, then we wouldn't have to spend all the money. And it also led to a later paper where I actually then extended the DEA approach, the methodology, to measure adequacy. So I came up with a mathematical model to come up with how we can actually measure adequacy, controlling for all the other factors, the inefficiency and the cost, et cetera. What I found here is that academic emergency districts are highly inefficient. Not all of them, but a lot of, on average, they were. And there's a high amount of inefficiency that was in the data there. Okay, and then from this point, for me, it gets a little redundant to keep looking at states. But I had a couple students who were taking my efficiency class, my production class, and they wanted to do it. And as they did it, I was asked to write a book chapter for Springer. And so I agreed to include them. Sam was the lead author, did a lot of the work. And what we found from these results, substantial inefficiency. On average, over $2,000 per pupil was wasted. This is for, I believe, elementary schools. Yeah. And, but there's still that notion that there's a lot of schools, the average school has to pay nearly $2,000 per pupil extra because of the harshness of the environment. And the interesting one, the environmental costs were largely driven in Illinois by the high teacher prices. So the large cost that we saw due to the environment was actually the teacher prices. And percent minority and some of the other ones were also economically and statistically significant, as you would expect. But the large one was the teacher prices, which I thought was interesting. I threw it in the slide only because of the recent strike that was up there in Chicago.